Do you want me to go as far back as when I was in elementary school and I was in fifth grade with Fidel Castro's son?
I mean,
That
you're
could be
welcome
interesting
to.
for sure.
It could be interesting.
Hello, Perry.
Greetings, Greensboro, Ohio.
Welcome, Perry. Thank you for joining us. So since it's Rachel and I's first time meeting you, tell us a little bit about Perry Silverman as a gamer, as a person.
Well, I grew up in Queens, New York, where the first 10 years of my life was fairly unremarkable, except I wound up in fifth grade at PS20 in Queens with Fidel Castro's son. And
Wow.
I knew nothing about that until one day we were all called to a school assembly. And in the assembly hall was this tall guy in a beard and khakis, said that he was there to retrieve Fidelito Castro and bring him back to Cuba. We were given a bronze bust, which the newspaper said was a bust of Jose Marti, but thinking back, it sure looked a lot like Fidel.
Whoa.
And the last I saw of it, it was being wheeled into a closet off the side of the assembly hall stage.
Wow.
Scrolling forward, my first interest in war games flared up when I walked into a game shop and bought a copy of Avalon Hill's D-Day. And I was in junior high school at the time.
That was my first game too.
When I
That's cool.
when I mastered the game, I started looking for people who I could play with, and found an article in the New York Times about this wargaming club that was meeting weekends in a classroom at St. John's University. So I went there one weekend and met up with the guys there, including one fellow named Fred Schachter.
Oh, okay.
And we became fast friends, and I've known Fred since our high school days. And of course, he went on to become a GMT designer and developer. But before then, Fred and I used to go down to the basement offices of SPI, where first we're press ganged into assembling copies of S&T magazine. And I remember the days of pushing the unassembled copies onto a saddle stapler. And after that, he and I were doing playtesting for Jim Dunnigan. I playtested titles such as Panzerblitz and Origins of World War II. And long before Avalon Hill put them on the market. But of course, being the wise guy that I was, being young and foolish, I got Jim a little irked at me when I tried to break Origins of World War II. The game was set up on a point system such that if the German player scored enough points to win, it also meant automatically that World War II broke out. But I found a gap in his matrix, and so I played the German player in a way to try to win the game, but not start World War II. And I still remember, what are you doing? Well, Jim, I'm trying to win the game and not start World War II. And after that, SPI moved from its 14th Street basement headquarters to a building on East 23rd Street in Manhattan. And at the time, I was living just 3 blocks away. So I would come home from college. I left New York City for Albany, and I would come home weekends and Friday nights would play test at the 23rd Street location. So playtesting went far beyond what Dunnigan was doing for Avalon Hill. We were playtesting SPI's own box games and magazine games. Flash forward where when I was in college, I started studying game theory and simulations. Went off to law school after that, but then when I graduated law school, the poli-sci department at Ohio State offered me research assistantship to continue my work in simulations and game theory. So that's how I wound up in Columbus, Ohio. And what should have been a PhD program got caught short because the Attorney General's office offered me a job where I could be a trial lawyer and an in-house campaign strategist. So I took the master's at Ohio State, said thank you, and went on to my full-time work at the AG's office, and from there into private practice. And from there, met up with someone who turned out to be a good friend and neighbor of mine named Brad Stock. And one day, Brad asked me, if I'd be willing to work with him on a successor to Pursuit of Glory, which was already in print. He had promised GMT that he would work on an East Front core and division level game, and handed me a rudimentary map board that he had started, and said, "Oh, by the way, I'm taking a full-time job teaching at a college out of state, so this is yours."
Wow. Okay.
And from there on, I went on to design the rest of what turned out to be Illusions of Glory First Edition.
Wow.
Nice.
That's a cool story.
Yes.
That is a cool story. I like it.
One of your questions is why? Why Illusions of Glory? Well, aside from the fact that Brad had already promised it to GMT, why do that when Paths of Glory was so popular? Well, I enjoyed the Pursuit of Glory design because it was core and division as opposed to Paths of Glory, Army, and core. It was a lot more granular, and I enjoy granular. More than that, while designing Illusions of Glory, First Edition, I read up on what players had to say about their experiences with Paths of Glory. And three things popped out. One, people were a little perturbed at the fact that units that came on late in the game were just as strong as units that started the game, which in the course of war, you're going to have degradation of your manpower pool. So the later arriving units should be weaker. The second was that people weren't happy with the out of supply rule, because the rule allowed a sharp player to cut off supply of his opponent late in what they call the action phase. And because any unit out of supply in the action phase would be automatically eliminated, as opposed to being given a chance to fight back or fight out of entrapment. And the third, I don't want to call it complaint, but observation, was it was hard to trigger the Russian Revolution in Paths of Glory. So with that in mind, I tried to design a game that introduced elements which you wouldn't find in Pursuit or Paths of Glory. And these were three things. One was national will, and national will is a measure which could lead to uprisings in the host country and revolution in Russia. And I tied national will to the loss of victory point spaces in the home country, to a point where if it got down low enough, then you'd start having uprisings in the home country, which would be symbolized by units without movement, but could do things like cut off supply and create all kinds of problems. And of course, with regard to Russia, if the Russian Revolution card was played at the time that an uprising unit was in Russia, then you'd have the Russian Revolution. So it made it easier to have the Russian Revolution than in Paths of Glory. Also, I introduced troop quality, which meant that given the number of troop losses, or the need to keep pulling on reinforcements, it would reduce troop quality as the manpower reserve, such that when it got down low enough, units would start coming on the board with a step loss in the reinforcement phase. So in other words, it reduced the value of late arriving units to address, well, why are all these units the same value? Well, they're not in Illusions of Glory. Not if a commander allows so much loss in manpower material that what arrives later is going to be weaker.
Right.
It's funny that those things that people said about Paths of Glory, some people would say it's a feature, not a bug. Some people would say it's a bug, not a feature. But it's funny to me that sometimes it was the simulation people. We have simulation players that play for competition. Sometimes it was the simulation people that wanted something different, like with lesser strength units at the end of a war. Sometimes it was the game player people that wanted something different, like they hated, well, not all of them, but some of them hated that out of supply rule, because somebody who was really sharp could win a game, even though historically, it didn't look like that. But, I bow to Ted because he designed the game he wanted to design. The question I have for you is, for somebody who's played the first edition of Illusions of Glory, what are they going to get in this new edition?
Here is what you're going to get in the new edition. You're going to get a more accurate historical map board. You're going to get a more accurate order of battle, especially with regard to the Italian army. You're going to get a cleaner rule set. And speaking of out of supply rules, what Illusions has is, instead of an automatic elimination at the end of an action phase, what you'll have instead is step loss and the ability of an out of supply unit to fight itself out of the pocket, which is historically correct because right after the Battle of Tannenberg, which was a tremendous German victory in World War I, some German corps wound up having advanced so far that they ended up out of supply. And they had to fight their way back out to the German front lines. And it just so happened that the path was blocked by simply a weak Russian division. And so they were able to fight their way out. And so the design that I put into Illusions allows for that.
Nice.
You don't have automatic elimination. You have the chance to fight your way out so that out of supply losses dribbled out over time, and it's not an immediate elimination.
Good, thank you.
That makes sense.
So I saw that you created a multiplayer variant for the game, right?
In the earlier design, yes, before the pandemic, when people could actually get together, yes, I created a multiplayer variant that Fred Schachter and I kicked around during development, and that I was told later on wasn't necessary for the box game, but I still have it in my computer files for later publication in a magazine, if you wish.
Yeah, maybe send it to Rachel in Inside GMT.
Yeah, well, it's right there. All I have to do is just download it and send it. What that does, it's a 4-player game because you have the Russian player, and then you have the Allied player, co-players. Then you have the Germans and the Austrians. Now, the interesting thing about this system, which lends itself to some fun around the gaming table, is that it's an 8-card hand to be shared by each side. So to represent, for example, leadership issues on the Central Power side, where you had Conrad for the Austrians, but he was basically subordinate to the German High Command. A player can play all 8 cards in his turn, and even a card that his co-player doesn't want him to take. And so Fred's remark was, it'll lead to some interesting chats around the gaming table.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that was your 4-player variant, which allowed players to, out of an 8-card hand as opposed to the original 7-card hand, play any card in alternating terms between the 2 players. And since you have an equal number of action rounds, each player could get on each side an equal number of chances in an action phase. But I like the idea of being able to pluck a card out of someone else's hand that they want to use or didn't want you to use.
Yes.
I can see Fred's DNA in that for sure. He likes doing that in multiplayer games.
Yes.
So Perry, I'm an old grog nerd, I guess, like so many of our players. It sounds like you too. One of the things that I really that appealed to me with Illusions of Glory is all of a sudden I get lots more map spaces to play with, and you know it really blows up the East Front, the Austrian front, the Balkan front, the Italian front. So just your I want 2 things, like your evaluation of which front benefited most from this, and also which one's your favorite to play.
Let me start out with Mark Simonich's first comments when he saw the map board. Why so many spaces?
Yeah, I like it.
And I said, a lot more territory. Russia's a big place.
Well, it would be hard to do that, to change the unit scale and keep the same map scale. I think players would look at that and say something's wrong here.
And that's exactly right, which is why there were a lot more spaces, a lot more military objectives for a smaller scale or core scale game. So as far as what front to play, well, of course, the Eastern Front is fun to play because you are bashing heads with either the Austrian side or the German side or both at any given time. And also the fact that the game gives the Allied Powers player a choice of fronts to start. You can play a 4-point card to invade Prussia, or you can play a 4-point card which is designated for Galicia, and take your pick. You can go either direction. It allows what ifs of all kinds. And then, of course, there's the Italy issue, which I drew a lot of grief from playtesters and players alike because, one, the Italians get a lot of units.
Yeah.
And if the Central Powers player isn't wary and doesn't put enough units in place to block an Italian scourge, as one playtester complained, you're going to wind up with Italian units running all over the place. And I thought that was a great idea.
What about the Balkan front? What does this do anything to help you there to make it more fun?
Not until the French and the Brits arrive. Basically, in the Balkan front, the Serbs are forced to hold their own, which they can for a while. And of course, the rules allow for the usual escape through Albania if forced. But if under the trench rules, if the Serbs entrench, they can make it a very hard time for the Austrian player to come in. And of course, we have the special rule that certain Austrian units at the start of the game can't enter Serbia because those units belong to the Austrian Second Army, which Conrad had ordered to the Russian front. So those units may be sitting on the Serbian border, but they can't go in. So yeah, the Central Powers player has a choice of either just letting those guys sit there until 1915 or send them to the Russian front where they'll be needed. So in other words, the avenue of invasion into Serbia is restricted and usually will come in through the western side. And that's where the Serbs laid their trap for the Austrian units to enter Serbia through a narrow mountainous front. And they were stopped until such time in the future as they were able to get assist from Bulgaria and Germany. So it's basically like Battle of the Bulge: hold until relieved. Bend but don't break. You go from mountain space to mountain space, entrench, and hold until the Allies arrive.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing that I found out with Illusions 1 was that the Central Powers player was not playing the Bulgaria card because it allowed then prompt entry of French and British units from the Mediterranean. So they wouldn't play it at all. And so what we did was to adjust that to allow the British and French units to enter in through a second card that was under the Allied players' control.
Gotcha.
So you're trying to keep the Brits out, fine. Don't play Bulgaria, but you're going to get them anyway. Once the Allied Powers player gets his hands on the Council of War card. So there are avenues in and about, and it's just a matter of how the two sides want to play it. Of course, the strategies, the grand strategies are different between the two sides. The Central Powers player needs to try to grab as many Russian victory spaces as possible early so that it triggers uprising and then revolution in Russia. And it's up to the Allied player to hold off those assaults on the Russian victory spaces and see if they can put enough hurt on the Austrian player that they can gather their victory spaces down south. The Prussian strategy requires a lot of luck as well as skill. It requires an early attack into Prussia and enough victories that the German player gets pushed back. But failing a total collapse of the Prussian front, the Prussian front, it's unlikely that the Allied player is going to be able to capture enough spaces in Germany to force an early win, an automatic victory.
That's cool. Thanks, Perry.
I was curious to know, you mentioned in one of your Inside GMT articles that the Italian front map was going to be changing in the second edition, like you're adding something. Can you tell us more about that?
Okay, well, here's where I tip my hand. I added a regional space in the Italian front map, which is on the far western edge of the map. Its intent is to create a link with a Western Front game if that comes to pass.
Oh, nice.
Okay.
Because I had been receiving a lot of mail saying, when are you going to do a West Front game that we could link together and have some fun with?
Okay.
And so in Illusions, you have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk card, which will enable the release of German units to a Western Front game for historically accurate campaigns in 1918.
So Perry, you have I know Rachel has a question about cards, because you've mentioned now 5 or 6 things. No, Rachel, you go ahead and ask your question. But as you've been talking, it's like whetting my appetite, because you say there's 2 different ways you can go depending on cards at the start. There's a couple of cards that can get the Brits and the French in. There's cards that maybe can link to another game. Okay, so I'm all in on cards. So now, Rachel, I want to know what Rachel asks about cards.
Well, Luke's actually going to ask, but
oh, Luke. Okay, go, Luke.
Yeah.
I want to know more about the cards. That's the deal.
Yeah. So obviously, in card-driven games, their cards are very important. Is there one card or a few cards in the game that you're especially proud of, or that are your favorites that you like to play?
No, because of the balance that's there. Each card contributes to the game. The one thing I take pride in is that I've connected reinforcement cards to troop quality, and if you play too many troop cards, you're going to reduce troop quality to the point where your later reinforcements are going to be diminished in value.
That's slick. I like that.
That's the most important feature. Of course, you've got in the total war phase of the game, you've got some cards that can really upset the balance late in the game. For example, if you have the Central Powers on the verge of achieving automatic victory in a certain point range, the Russian player, under right circumstances, can play the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ends the campaign in Russia and basically stalls the Central Powers juggernaut to automatic victory.
Nice. Take that.
It's basically a take that.
Yeah.
If the Central Powers player overreaches, then you can play that one card to stop the inevitable. And that's basically it. It's a counterweight against overreaching. So the Central Powers player can still win after that card's played, but you'll have to play the game through.
Yeah.
There'll be no automatics now.
And I'm not familiar with the hand mechanic. Do you have to discard your hand at one point, or can you just, if you get that card, can you keep it in your...
I have changed the hand mechanic from both Pursuit and Paths of Glory.
Okay.
It used to be that a combat card, once played during an action phase, remains on the board and can be played again over and over in subsequent battles. And I found that to be too powerful because you have some really powerful Central Powers cards like Mustard Gas that should not be allowed to be played over and over again in the same hand, on the same phase. So the rule I've instituted is those cards, when played, are no longer removed from the board once they're played, but go back in the deck, but can only be played once. You play it once and it goes back in the deck. So that instead of playing it perpetually in a phase and then removing it from the board, you play it once in a combat and then it goes back in the deck to sometime be found again.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's, just broadening beyond this game or even Paths of Glory. That's one of my favorite things about this whole card-driven genre that Mark Herman created. Just watching how all the subsequent designers use card mechanisms and the cards and exactly how you use those and what you do with, reinforcements isn't even in some of the games, right? It's just fascinating to me And I think on the whole, I look at it as a gamer and go, they've done a pretty darn good job of molding those CDG mechanics to the topic that they're focusing on. So it sounds like you've done more of the same with Pursuit of Glory.
Well, you have to have historical events because that's how you have event cards. But one thing that a Russian scholar brought to my attention was predicates for the Russian Revolution. It didn't just happen by itself. The Russian Revolution was triggered by food riots. And so I inserted a food riot card as a prerequisite to Russian Revolution. So what you have there, it makes revolution more difficult, but not as impossible as some other games. I set out conditions where if you wanted the Russian Revolution, you first had to play the food riot card. And then if you wanted to play the revolution card, you still had to have an uprising unit somewhere in Russia. So it's not automatic, but it's not impossible.
In the case of the treaty card that you were talking about, if the Russian player has the card, but the conditions aren't met yet, because let's say the Central Powers haven't overreached into Russia, then do they hold? Can you just hold on to the card until
the card has other values too?
It gets discarded, and then you have to wait to draw it again.
Well, that's the point. The card has ops points to be used for movement and activation.
Right.
It also has replacement points on it to use for replacements or during the replacement phase to build up.
You might really need those.
And you might really need those. So there's the crunch. There is the dilemma and the sweat that the players will have to go through. Do I hold on to this card? There are 40 points on the general records track. Space number 40 is Armistice. And before Armistice, you could get automatic victory. The treaty card can only be played between spaces number 35 and 40.
Oh.
Got it.
That's what I mean by overreaching. If the Central Powers player is racking up points in the hope of forcing an early armistice and a victory, or to get to the automatic victory marker, the card can be played in that gap to stop the Central Powers player from reaching either.
Right.
It prolongs the game. It makes the two parties have to fight it out to the armistice date in 1918. And so it gives the Allied powers a fighting chance to come back.
Right.
Because with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, a number of German units have to leave the board. And that pool would, in a West Front game, provide the pool that goes to the Western Front.
Right.
Right.
But they're removed from active combat in the Eastern Front. And that's what happened to Austria when the Russians dropped out. The Germans sent all these troops to the Western Front and left the Austrians fairly naked in defending themselves. So
because the Americans were on the Western Front.
And they wanted to get enough troops to the Western Front before the Americans arrived to score a victory over the French and the British. So that's where playing that card can actually turn the game, because a lot of German units that find themselves stuck in Russia have to leave.
Doggone it, Perry. I got so many games to play, and now you got me hankering to go play Illusions to Glory.
Then I only have one more thing to say. Buy my game.
Yes, we will link below to pre-order the second edition.
But this has been fun, and designing that game be fun. And if it sells, then I'll certainly propose to GMT that we have a Western Front game. But there are so many now new titles I see coming out. It's hard to decide what you want to play with.
That is true.
And there's a bash of political games.
Yes.
Hey now, come on.
I'm the guy who started playing diplomacy in junior high school, and sold the game when I started creating enemies.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yes.
Well, Perry, we'll let you go soon, but we have a couple more questions that we like to ask all our guests on GMT Talk if you're interested. Okay. So do you have a favorite game by another GMT designer that you'd like to talk about?
Wow. I enjoy all of the Civil War era games. The Richard Byrd designs.
Nice.
I have a lot of fun with those. Well, I became interested in Civil War battles with my exposure to Civil War miniatures.
Mhm.
And then I moved to pushing cardboard around in Civil War environments. I'm looking forward to 3 days of Gettysburg.
Yes.
And so the Berg designs are fun. Matter of fact, I ran into Richard Berg years ago at an Origins convention where he was about to pack up what he was selling, including his one last copy of the original 3 Days of Gettysburg. He wanted X dollars. I was willing to pay just Y dollars, and eventually got to talk him down. So he said, listen, Richard, you don't want to haul this all back home with you, do you?
That's right.
Which was my favorite when I'm at a convention trying to buy a game.
Oh yeah, that's the last day of the convention talk for sure.
Yes, at Sunday talk. So he caved in and he sold me this blue box, which was 3 Days first edition.
Nice.
So I have a lot of fun with those. I'm also, of course, interested in any World War I designs because that's something I took an interest in when Brad drafted me into this. I could wind up buying everything and bankrupting myself.
Yeah, don't do that.
But that's exactly what gamers do.
Yeah.
True.
You should see my collection. Matter of fact, one of my collections was a Fred Schachter designed first edition Siege of Jerusalem that he published himself years ago. In exchange for some legal work that I gave him, he gave me 3 copies of the game. I negotiated a contract with Avalon Hill, and he gave me 3 copies of his original edition. I was able later to sell those in eBay. They paid for my trips to various conventions.
Wow.
That's nice.
Very cool.
I think I was selling them for $150 a pop. That's much different than the early days where I bought my first edition of D-Day for $5.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even back then, California had inflation because I bought mine for $6.
I'm terribly sorry, but I was on the East Coast at the time.
Yeah.
So yes, so the Richard Berg designs I find very intriguing. Anything tactical, and those games fit the bill.
Well, our other question that we ask is, who are a few people in the gaming hobby who've had a positive influence on you as a gamer or as a game designer?
Well, Fred Schachter for sure, because we've known each other for years,
Right.
and he's a designer, developer, and player who I could never beat, no matter what. You pick the Avalon Hill game during these gaming club sessions, and I would just lose my rear end to him. It could be Battle of the Bulge. It could be Stalingrad. You pick it. I think that's one of the reasons why I started getting into miniatures, because I couldn't beat him in any board games. and of course, the limited amount of time I had with Jim Dunnigan, who was, I can tell you some stories, but definitely not for publication. In any event, watching him work and his meticulousness with his designs, that's what got me interested in the first place. I said, I'd like to design a game one day, but between practicing law and managing election campaigns, I really never had the time. Then, of course, I eased back on the throttle, got out of politics, eased back on my legal practice, and then Brad came along saying, would you like to do this? I said, why not? I've always been wanting to.
And by the way, it's all yours.
Yeah, it's basically what he said. Said, I'm going off to teach school. Here you go. Okay.
Finish it all for me.
Yeah. Well, all I had was the map at the time.
Oh, you did it. Hey.
Yeah.
All the rest. It took me about 3 years from the time he approached me to the time the game went to print. The game went to print in 2017, and I think I started the process in 2014.
It's not bad at all.
That's a great timeline.
I respect anybody who can finish a game because there's a lot of people who can't.
Well, it was my reputation on the line. If I didn't finish, everybody would hate me.
Yeah, I had that thought a few times, Mr. President, mostly because my kids told me it was true.
Okay.
That's right. I should tell you about the first comment that I got back from my master's advisor when I showed him my thesis, which was a simulation and a predictive model of an election campaign. He said it had much predictive capacity as flipping a coin.
Ooh.
Ouch.
Yeah. In addition to telling me it was god awful, so I had to go back to the drawing board and eventually find something that passed muster.
That's how we get better, I guess.
Yep.
Practice makes perfect.
It's been fun hanging out with you, Perry.
I enjoy this. Public speaking it's been second nature to me, going back to my trial work days. So getting into a podcast, no problem. I have fun. I am going to print out a hard copy prototype of Illusion 2nd edition, and I'll be taking it to Origins in Columbus
Oh, cool.
for a demo. I've submitted the proposal, and I'm waiting for confirmation.
Come to Origins.
It's in Columbus, so my travel costs are
Low.
kind of minimal.
Great. That's perfect. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us, Perry, and being our guest on GMT Talk.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been fun.
We will see everyone next time on GMT Talk.
Bye now.